Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for another Grow With Us Parenting Series webinar. I'm Dr. Kaylene Henderson, for those of you who haven't met me yet. I'm a child and adolescent psychiatrist based on the Gold Coast, and a mum of three who are now all at school, a little bit ahead of your little ones, but hopefully it puts me in a nice position to be able to share what I know, both as a professional and as a parent, for getting your little ones ready to start and succeed at school. So this is our topic today, school readiness, supporting your child during their transition. Now I'm going to assume that either you've got children who are aged in that 3 to 5 age range, or you're just extremely organised and want to know all the information well before you get there, which isn't a bad thing, to be honest, just so you know what you're aiming for and how to prepare your child as best you can. This is the approach we're going to take tonight. We're going to have a look at factors to consider when determining whether or not your child is ready to start and succeed at school. We'll look at what you can do if you're still feeling a bit unsure. And then, assuming you are going to start your child at school, if not, in the coming year, then in the year ahead, what you can do to actually prepare for a really smooth start when they do get there. And then there'll actually be plenty of time for questions at the end. So particularly with this one, because I know there are a lot of, individual concerns that come up for your little ones regarding school readiness, there'll be a big chunk of time at the end for you to pop your questions in the chat box, and I'll try to get to as many of those as I can to be able to help you get as much as you can out of tonight's webinar. The session will be recorded. If you find yourself having a duck off because, nights are tricky when you've got children, then don't worry, you can catch up with the recording. The questions, though, won't be recorded, so feel free to ask away, and they'll be, kept de-identified and confidential for you. Okay, so this is our topic, school readiness, and it simply refers to, as I suggested, how prepared your young child is to start and succeed at school. It's really normal for little ones to feel apprehensive about this change because it's a big one. Some children will take it completely in their stride, particularly if you have a little adventurous spirit who's, happy to take on any new challenge and, welcomes change like that. It's called novelty seeking as part of their temperament trait. I've spoken about temperament before, but if they have a novelty seeking temperament trait, then they're likely to seek out new experiences, welcome new experiences, and really take a lot of enjoyment out of newness. Of course, there are other children on the flip side of that who find newness and change pretty worrying, and who are a bit more apprehensive about that, may find all the big changes that do come with school to be quite daunting. There's a new environment to get used to, new teacher to child ratios that they won't have experienced before in your early learning settings. There's different routines, different rules. There's all sorts of experiences that they won't yet have had, that they might feel unsure about. Of course, if you have a child who's I'm just thinking about mine. My oldest was feeling a bit apprehensive about school because it was completely new. It wasn't just new to her, it was new to my family. But by the time my third child came along, he was born about 2 months before my oldest child started preschool. And the preschool campus was co-located with the school that they all went to. So he literally grew up at school most days. He knew the campus. He felt part of the school community. He knew the teachers. He knew a lot of the children who attended and their younger siblings who would come across at school drop-off and school pickup. So for him, the experience was quite different. There are lots of factors that will come into play as to whether your child finds this new change to be a daunting one or whether it's something that they're happy to take on without too much concern. The main things for us to consider are these two things. We need to consider, A, whether they're ready to start and succeed at school. And in a moment, I'll go through a bit of a checklist. So there'll be 3 slides, 12 questions, and I want you to keep your little one in mind as we go through those, as you kind of start to figure out whether or not your child is ready to start. And then for when they're ready to start, be that next year or the year after, We're going to have a look at tips for how you prepare them. This is your job. It's just deciding whether or not they're ready and then making that transition as smooth as possible by preparing them as best you can. Okay. Now, once upon a time, certainly when I was a child, it was thought to be important for your child to be a certain age, the same age as everyone else who started school. You know, when they hit 5, they were ready. It was considered to be important whether or not they already knew their alphabet, whether they knew their numbers, whether they were ready to read and write, you know, how intelligent they were. That was all taken into consideration as to whether or not a child was ready for school. But we know that those factors aren't actually the most important ones these days. And in fact, social and emotional skills are key. They're critical in determining whether children are actually ready to start. There's a couple of other factors too there, of course. How well your child can communicate is important. Whether your child has developed sufficient fine motor skills to be able to, you know, literally hold a pencil for those early literacy tasks that they'll be engaged with as soon as they start school. And how independent they are with certain tasks, like toileting, of course, you know, opening lunchboxes, all sorts of things like that, filling up water bottles, how independently they can manage. But the key factors, as you'll see when we go through the next few slides, are actually their social and emotional readiness. So these are the ones I want you to really focus on as we go through the next few slides. And as we do, and as I go through these next 12 questions, I just want you to keep your little one in mind. And perhaps if you spot one that your child hasn't yet mastered, which will be the case for many of us, of course, it's still some time away before school starts. What I want you to do, if you've got a pen or paper handy or got a phone handy with a notes app, is just write down those one or two things that you think, you know what, we might work on that a little bit more, or I might hold that in mind a little bit longer as I reflect on whether or not my child's ready to start. Okay, let's get started. So this is our checklist. Firstly, I want you to consider whether or not your child's able to get along with others, including members of your family, their current teacher at your Only About Children learning service, and of course, friends and classmates of the same age. So it's really important that your little one is able to generally get along with others. Now, I'm going to say generally a lot, or maybe I won't. Maybe I'll spare you. Maybe you should just assume that it's there, because the reality is none of our children will nail these situations all the time. None of our children will be perfect at all of these things all of the time. They simply haven't been on the planet long enough to be able to master all of these tasks 100% of the time. But I want you to think, as a general rule, is my child ... So as a general rule, is your child able to join in with a group or cooperate with others in play? Because that's important. Play in a school environment is often less structured. There's greater distances across ovals from your child, perhaps where the teacher is supervising. There is an expectation, more so from where they've been, that your child will be able to, generally speaking, join in with others and cooperate in play. Not to only engage in play where they're the ones that set the rules or they have to take charge. And certainly not if they have a low threshold to kind of lash out, shout, hurt, etc. It's important that, for the most part, they're able to get along with others. Is your child able to make sense of other people's behaviours and feelings? This is a big one. But obviously it helps. It helps if your child is able to make sense of the intentions, the behaviours, the feelings of others. And of course, this is something that will be an ongoing coaching process, but again, something to keep in mind that will make that transition a lot smoother if your child has this on board already. Can your child think of appropriate solutions when conflict arises? And it might be that, you know, the solution is asking a teacher for help, or it might be saying to a child who's speaking unkindly to them or hurting them, you know, stop, I don't like it. It doesn't need to be, you know, a complex response, but there needs to be ideally some ability on your child's behalf to be able to think of something to do in those situations. Again, if we're hitting on anything that you think, no, my child hasn't mastered that yet, this is just something we're going to come to in a moment. These are things that we can practice and upskill on. But it's useful to keep in mind as we go through the checklist, if there is anything there you wanted to flag with your child in mind. Is your child able to listen to and follow directions? This is important. There'll be a lot of whole class instruction when your child starts school, and it is important that your child's able to listen to those instructions, to be able to make sense of those, and to follow direction as much as possible. So again, it takes in their, language comprehension, their hearing, and their ability to cooperate and follow through. These are all important skills to ideally have on board before you start school. Will your child be able to communicate well with their teacher and classmates? And this is going to be a tricky one for some of our little ones, particularly those with speech and language disorders. For me, with my 3 kids, my oldest 2 daughters, when I reflected on these, checklist questions, I was able to pretty easily go, yep, tick, 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 tick. They've got these skills. They're ready to go. For my son, who's, equally intelligent, beautiful human, gets along well with others, but he had a motor speech disorder, which meant that his mouth muscles weren't able to coordinate terribly well, and he had trouble articulating his words. So that was one that I had to think, is weighing up, is that extra year going to make a big difference there, or is it better that he's in with his peer groups and we just kind of work on that through the year? Is it good enough for him to start? Is his communication ability good enough for him to start? And I had to seek advice on that, and that may well be the case for some of your children too. You've got other people in your village, your educator, your incoming teachers who can also guide you on this decision making. Is your child able to manage his or her behaviour in different social settings? Your child, there will be expectations around behaviour, and more so in a school setting than is present in their current, kindergarten, preschool room. Is your child able to seek out a teacher's help if needed? That's really important that they know that they can go to a teacher for help, whether it's for social challenges or learning challenges. We don't want our children to slip through the cracks or feel like they can't advocate for themselves. So it's really important, again, that this is something our children feel able to do. Okay, these are our last 4 questions. Is your child able to pay attention to and persist with tasks? Now, this is a tricky one, particularly when we're talking about 3, 4, 5-year-olds, because this ability is obviously still developing. And I'm certainly not suggesting that your children should be able to sit there, and attend to concentrate on on a not terribly engaging task for, say, a 2-hour stretch. That's actually not practical for any little person. But for reasonable stretches of time, is your child able to pay attention to and persist with tasks? Because if your child can't do that at all, then they are going to find the school environment, the learning environment, the classroom environment really challenging. And learning is going to be quite difficult for them. So in some situations it's not actually about, well, maybe we give it another year. Sometimes it's also about asking for, seeking out an assessment, asking for professionals' advice. But again, it's just helpful to know that the parts we pay attention to, and this is one of those key factors that will influence how well your child manages in the school environment. Does your child feel good about him or herself and others? That's an interesting one. So do they, if they're troubled by any sort of depressive or anxious symptoms, then that might get in the way for them starting school and feeling settled at school. So just something to flag if that's present. Does your child have a positive attitude towards starting school? Again, sometimes we can preempt some challenges if we have a little one who's just really reluctant to go. And again, it's not to say that they shouldn't, but we might need to work on that in this valuable time we have available to us between now and school starting. And is your child able to perform basic tasks, for example, going to the toilet without adult help? Now, you'll see that's the only one that's not a social emotional skill. All the other ones we've touched on are. which really drives home the importance of that social and emotional maturity being really key to school readiness. But of course, this last question is always worth asking. There'll be a whole lot expected of our children when they go to school. Toileting is essential, independent toileting. That's not to say they won't occasionally have a slip up, and prep teachers will be well used to that. If you think that might be an issue for your child, then you take precautions for that. You pack a spare, pair of pants, skirt, whatever your child needs. And you perhaps flag it with the teacher, and also have the discussion with your child in terms of, what happens if you have an accident. But it's really important that your child feels able to pop their hand up when they need to be able to go to the toilet, that they ask assertively to go to the toilet, and that they know how to manage that situation if it does, go a bit pear-shaped. But for the most part, your child needs to be able to manage toileting without any assistance. So as we've gone through that list, this really comes down to, where does your child sit now? Keeping your child in mind as we've reflected on what are the important elements. Is your child ready? It might be that if you've gone through and gone, yep, got that, then your child does sound ready for school, and you can feel confident that the abilities they've developed are enough. It's not about whether or not they can write a paragraph or read a book. They are absolutely not essential skills for starting school. And there's plenty of time to learn all the other literacy and numeracy skills that come, of course, with schooling. But if you think your child has the key social emotional factors on board, then you can feel confident that they're ready. There'll be others of you listening to that who think, you know what, I don't think my child's ready, and I think they actually need another year. Which is great. It's great to land there, because then you have got that time and you make use of that time. So you think, okay, well, which are the areas that I need to help my child with in that time that we have, and how am I going to go about addressing those areas, those gaps that they still need to work on a little bit before they get to school. Perhaps, though, you sit in that in-between grey area. This is where it gets a little bit tricky, and this is what I mentioned about my son too with the communication. It might be that most of those things on the list are covered, but there might be one or two things that you're still not sure about, or that you wonder whether or not you need the extra time for. To be honest, it's about identifying those goals and working out, can we kind of get there well enough in the time that we have left, or would they be more advantaged by having that extra time again with the year off, another year before they start school? And if you do land there, if you're in that sort of grey area where you're thinking, gosh, they're mostly there, but I'm just not sure, then this is the approach. You speak to your child's educator. Your child's educator is really well placed, knowing your child as they do, having seen them in the classroom environment, having seen many children become ready for school throughout their own careers. They'll be perfectly placed to advise you on whether or not they think that your child is ready, and if not, what can be done to get them ready. What can be done in the classroom environment to be able to meet those extra, address those extra skills that need addressing. What can be done in the home environment? You just kind of tap into that team, that village that you have access to, and you have those discussions. Okay, well, what can you do here? What should I do at home? When should we meet back and discuss, progress, where we're up to, especially if you're still hoping to meet that, deadline of end of the year. You really do need to be a bit proactive about it, and do touch base regularly to find out if your child's still tracking okay to be able to get there in time. The other option too, of course, is to meet with the principal of the school you've chosen for your child. That's really worthwhile, because sometimes it's worth just laying it out and saying, look, this is where my child's at. These are the things they've mastered. These are the things they're yet to master. What are your thoughts? What can be done for my child if we do start, if they're needing that extra support? What are the rules around keeping them on the list for now, but then pulling back in December if it's looking by that stage that they're not going to be ready? Because it's tricky. Sometimes you won't know until, right towards the end of the year. what the school's policy is on holding children back in that first year of school, if it does pan out that they are starting to get a little bit behind. You just really want to have these open discussions from the get-go, because the more well-informed you are about what the school processes are, whether the school thinks that your child's, ready for the demands of school, that they would be probably more confident to comment on, since it's been a while since, I went to school. I think it's a really worthwhile experience. And also, they're going to be your new team, your new village. You may as well start tapping into that support and that advice as early as you need to. The other option I would suggest, if you are thinking, you know what, my child's on track with quite a few things, but there's a couple of areas there, or there's one area there that, I actually think I might need to get checked out. Or, I've seen my child's peers be kind of ready at this level, but my child, for whatever reason, doesn't seem to be at the same level. I'm just wondering what the reason for that is. If that's where you're landing, hearing about these factors, then I would suggest you seek an assessment for your child. I always tell parents, and I've done this myself, honestly, with my kids. My approach, both professionally and as a parent, is I always have a super low threshold to get things checked, because I always think it's better to get things checked, even if it's to be told there's nothing wrong, than look back and wish that you had. I always think it's better just to seek a professional's opinion, get your concerns, addressed early, rather than just have them keep you up at night, and find out if there are any extra things that you need to be able to do for your child, to be able to, make sure they're on track to succeed at school as they should. The really tricky, complicating part with that at the moment, though, is that waiting lists are insane. For psychologists, for psychiatrists, for paediatricians, and even for other allied health professionals, speech therapists and occupational therapists, it's actually really hard to have your child seen in a timely way for an assessment. So, to be honest, if you are even thinking that your child might need an assessment at some point, my advice would actually just to be to get your child on a waiting list. Because if you're 6 months off being seen, you want to start that process now, rather than wait until you're thinking, yes, no, we definitely need it. Worst case, you cancel. You cancel that appointment, a few weeks out, and you make someone's day when they offered a cancellation appointment. And there's nothing lost in that. So certainly, if you're at all concerned that there might be other issues at play, then jump on a waiting list and seek some advice. Nothing was ever lost seeking advice. I think it tends to go the other way. Sometimes we as parents wish that we jumped on things earlier, but no one ever regrets doing things the other way. Okay, so let's look now at what you can do, some practical tips for preparing your child for when they do start school, whether that's going to be next January, the January after. Let's look at a few tips to be able to make that transition as smooth as you can. The main thing you can do is to build familiarity for your child. It's amazing because school is such a familiar concept to us. We've all spent an awful lot of time there. There can be some assumptions around what our children know already about school that actually aren't always the reality. Your child may well have driven past their school many times, but to know what goes on in there, what they do at school, what it looks like, feels like, sounds like, what the routine is, what the new rules are that they're yet to master. This is all completely new to your child. I remember when my oldest child started school, the night before she did, we sat down for a bedtime story, and she looked at me very earnestly and said, "Hey, thanks for reading tonight's story, Mummy. I've got this from tomorrow. I'll do tomorrow nights because I'm starting school tomorrow, so I'll be able to read tomorrow. So I've got tomorrow night's story covered. Thanks very much." And, despite the fact that we'd done all this preparation for what school was going to be like, there were still assumptions or expectations there for my child that weren't reality based. So talk as much as you can about school with your child. Talk about what it's going to be like. There's a whole lot of new rules that they might not be familiar with. Having to put up their hand and ask to go to the toilet might be new. Waiting for the bell to ring, hearing the bell ring might be a new concept. Having, dedicated lesson times and perhaps different teachers for different topics. They might have their main teacher, but then a different teacher for music or for sport or for a language if they learn languages at the school your child is heading to. And that exposure to different people, different teachers, that might be a new concept for your child. If there are any opportunities to visit the school ahead of time, take it. Go out of your way to take it. I know it's really hard to make time sometimes to have these experiences, but they're so valuable for your child. And when they're there, have a look at everything that is part of it, but is new for your child. So where would they take their bag in the morning? Where do they leave their bag? Where does their lunchbox go? Where does their water bottle go? Does that stay with their bag, as it often might? Where are the toilets? Where's their main classroom going to be? Will they have an opportunity to meet the teacher? As with all new transitions, even just moving from room to room within your current centre, it's the relationship they have with their teacher, which is going to be the most settling, grounding thing. It's not going to be it's great to have your own classroom, but to have your go-to person and to know your go-to person, that's the big stuff for children. So as quickly as you can help your child build that relationship with your teacher, the more quickly they will settle. Something that's often helpful, and I know I've mentioned this in the room transition webinar we've done before, is if you do have an opportunity for your child to meet their teacher ahead of time, and I know this isn't always practical, then to take a photo of the two of them together and pop that photo on your fridge so that your teacher becomes a familiar face in your family home. Consider all the other situations or other experiences that are based in and around school that your child might have to master. So if your child is going to go to the out of school hours care, the after school care room, then where is that room? How do they get themselves there? Do they wait? Does a teacher kind of collect them from classroom to classroom and take them all together, or do they need to get themselves there after school? Will they be catching a bus? And if so, where would they catch the bus from? What do they need to organise in order to catch the bus? Will they be buying food from the canteen, and how is that organised? Is that ordered online, or do they need to take money in? Different schools have different platforms still that they use, that it will be helpful for your child to be across. So really think broadly about what other situations might come up for your child that they might need to manage, and while you're there, really try to kind of knock out as many of those as you can. The other thing is to practice any tasks or situations that your child is yet to master. So opening lunch boxes, refilling water bottles, taking their shoes on and off if that's something they need to do. Sometimes some schools require them to change uniforms, particularly if they do swimming lessons at school or, different sporting activities. They might have to change their clothes, change their shoes. Is that something that your child might need a bit of practice with? Fine motor skills is a really big one. Your child will have a lot of demands on their fine motor skills. So the more you can do to practice that ahead of time, the better. So often, using big pieces of chalk or using pens, crayons, tweezers, anything you can do to build up those small muscles in your hand, really helpful activities ahead of time. Toileting, obviously, if that's something your child is yet to master, should be a big goal between now and then. And I was delighted to see that in your services they have Uniform Week and Lunchbox Week, which I've never heard of before, and sound like such a fabulous experience for kids to all come in their new uniforms and share the excitement of their new uniforms with each other, and to be able to practice with those school lunchboxes too. I love that your centres do this. I just remember this story. When I took my oldest daughter to the uniform shop a month or so before school started, the poor thing didn't hear me properly, and she thought we were heading to the unicorn shop, and she was dead set devastated when we got there, looking around, and there were zero unicorns. But she would have loved a uniform week, and I'm thrilled for your children. They get to experience that with their friends ahead of time. That's just such a great initiative. The other thing to do, once you've had to think about the practical tasks, have a think about the other situations they're likely to find tricky. And there are a whole heap of new situations your children are going to face when they go to school. What should they do if they start to feel sick? If they've had a toileting accident, they might, how do they know that they can go to the teacher with that? Because they can. But actually having a practice, having that conversation. So you can actually role play these and say, okay, so if you have an accident, you'll need to go to the teacher and tell them and ask them if you can go and get changed. So let's have a practice so you know what to do. Do you want to be you, or do you want to be the teacher? And do you want me to be you or the teacher? Okay, well, let's have a practice. And then we can swap over and both have a practice at being each person, just so you feel confident with what you need to do and say in those tricky situations. And it's the same for all of these. If they get hurt, what should they do? Do they know that they can go to sick bay if they get hurt during the lunchtime? My son has a knack of getting, in the way of projectiles in the playground. He's been hit with so many balls, not deliberately. He just seems to cross into their path fairly frequently. So he's pretty across where the sick bay is in case he needs to go and get an ice pack. But that's new. That's new for your little ones. How might they join in play? One of the things my kids found really tricky when they started school is they often sit together to eat their food, and then they're just kind of released onto the oval. It might be different in the school you're going to, but at my children's school, they were just released onto the oval. And my children would say, and then everyone looks the same. You just have all these little people, all kind of the same size, darting around, dressed the same with their big bucket hats pulled down. And it was really hard for them to actually find their new classmates, find their friends in amongst this sea of identical looking little humans. So one of the things that we practiced at home and that we kind of nutted out was that sometimes it's helpful to ask your friends while you're still eating, hey, can I play with you today? And where should I meet you if you finish eating before I do? But again, just having those conversations, nutting out those tricky situations ahead of time and practicing for those situations as much as you can. That's not to say, you can't prepare for every tricky situation, but the foreseeable ones, the predictable ones, it is worth preparing your child as much as you can. Does your child know anyone else starting school? Obviously, it's easier to feel more settled in an environment in which there's at least one familiar face. That's not to say if you're moving to a different area or your child's going to a different school from their classmates that they won't settle, but, it helps to have a familiar face in the first instance. So if that's available to your child, can you arrange for those play dates ahead of time over the, Christmas break before your child starts school? Or if not, how might you access those new kids ahead of time? I often see on, school Facebook pages or community online notice boards. We've got a community Facebook page just for our little suburb on the Gold Coast. And you often see people popping up there, hey, my little one's going to start at this particular school next year. Has anyone else got any little ones starting in the same year group? And would you mind if we caught up for a playground catch up before school starts so that they can meet someone familiar before they get. And I think they're great ideas to really tap into your neighbourhood, to your community, and just set your child up for success in terms of recognising and having go-to people, ideally from the get-go. It's not to say that they will be there forever friends, but it's nice to have some familiar faces when you start. Lots and lots of language exposure is really important, and this does come up in terms, not so much with school readiness, but certainly in terms of early literacy skills, which is an inevitable part of schooling, obviously, when they do start. So as much as we want our children to settle into the school environment, we also need to think beyond that in terms of how we can set our children up for success with their learning. And language exposure is a really big one. There's studies that have come out that say that children who are from really language-rich homes have, by the end of their, by the time they hit their third birthday, there are other children who have not come from such language-rich homes where they're not spoken to as much, there's not as much conversation around them, and those children have already heard 30 million fewer words in those first 3 years than their peers from language-rich environments. And that's a huge difference. And naturally, when we think about the scale of that, 30 million words is a lot. It's a big difference between, you know, different 3-year-old children all starting school at the same time. And it naturally will affect their vocabulary use, their phonological awareness, their, you know, capacity to communicate, as well as others might who've had that, you know, 30 million more word exposure. The catch is here, it has to be child-directed language. So it has to actually be occurring within their environment, but also children are involved in that, in those conversations. And it doesn't count if it's on a screen, and that's really important. So even if your child's listening to fabulous educational TV shows where there's a whole lot of language and great language use and storytelling, it doesn't seem to count in the same way that being exposed to your voice, your storytelling, your conversations, your nursery rhymes, all those other ways that we're, you know, your book reading, all those other child-directed ways do. So it's just worth having a think. If you think that that's something that that perhaps hasn't been present in your home so far, you know, how can you play a little bit of catch up there and expose your child just to as much language as you can between now and when they start school, and hopefully beyond. You just get into a bit of a habit of it then, because that will set your child up for success with their learning, and that is important, obviously. Speaking about books, though, there's a heap of books available in your local library about starting school, starting big school, and the feelings that are accompanied by that, and some of the new experiences that children will face. I know I've mentioned this website before, but littleparachutes.com is a great website that I often refer to, where picture books are filed under different topics. And what I've done before, if there is a new experience that I think, oh, it might be worth reading a few books about this with my little one, I've jumped on there, had a look at what books they suggest for those particular topics, ordered those from my local library, and then we've gone and picked them up together and read a few good ones together. Again, it's just helpful to, again, always just build that familiarity, so that your children kind of can be prepared as much as they can for what lies ahead. If you think that your child is going to find it tricky to say goodbye to you, then practice that too. Your children are at such a fabulous age. They learn through play, they learn through practice, they learn through repetition. If you know there are situations like this that your child is yet to master, then you can say to them, hey, I've been thinking about the fact that, you know, it might be tricky for us to say goodbye those first few times because that's been tricky for us at, you know, at kindy in the past. I wonder if that's something we should practice so that we both know how that's going to go when you do start school. And it's just all about that upskilling and, again, building that familiarity before the time comes. If you have a child with additional support needs, then make sure you do not hesitate to advocate for them, that you do meet with the school principal, with the learning support officers, with their upcoming classroom teacher, and you talk about, you know, your child's strengths, their challenges, what learning supports they might need put in place from the very beginning. So that your child feels supported from the start, and so that your child's teacher, with whom they'll develop this fabulous relationship, really knows your child and how they can best help them, because that's really helpful for the teacher too. Naturally too, you need to share any important medical information, particularly if your child has, you know, diabetes, asthma, allergies. These are things that the school absolutely needs to know, and will have action plans there in place so that they can jump in and help your child immediately if ever that's needed. And think broadly too, even if there aren't these kind of big things, big concerns, or diagnoses perhaps that you need to be able to share with the school, even if there are just other concerns or worries, or challenges that your child might face, you know, you share them with your school village, so that your new team, who are all wanting the best for your child, knows how best to bring out the best in them. When my little one, my son did start school, despite his communication challenges, he was able to speak, of course. It was just that his articulation wasn't terribly clear. But what became evident in the first few weeks is that some of the children in his class were having trouble understanding him and having trouble understanding why this articulation difficulty was there. And it was hard for my son to explain, being the young age that he was. So I met with his teacher, and his teacher suggested or asked, actually she approached me, and she asked if she could share a little bit of information with the class to be able to just understand why my son's difficulty existed and what they could do if they had trouble understanding him. And we essentially together wrote a little script for her to share. I involved my son in this so that he felt comfortable with this, and just explained that, you know, when your muscles get really, really tired, sometimes they get a bit floppy and they don't work as well, that my son's mouth muscles were sometimes like that. And so it made it a little bit hard for him to be able to say his words clearly. But that he was super smart and super lovely and had a lot of great things to share. And so that if ever they had trouble understanding him, they could just say, "Can you please say that again?" Or "Can you say that in a different way for me?" And that was actually just a really nice strategy that she suggested to bring everyone on the same page. And again, there'll be different situations where you might find yourself in where you need to advocate for or support your child. But remember always, you're working with the school to help your child. You shouldn't ever feel like you have to, go it alone. Hopefully, your upcoming school environments are going to be wonderful places of support to bring out the best in your child, to enable them to make wonderful friendships and to teach them some, really great stuff. Learning's great. At the same time, it is important to have realistic expectations of how long it takes to settle. At my children's school, they every year would celebrate, they would mark down the days and they would celebrate the first 100 days. So on day 100, they would have a party because they were well across the fact that it would take 100 school days for everyone to finally feel settled into this new place, experiencing all the newness that they had in those first few months. And 100 days, if you think about it, is a fair way in a school year. So it's not about expecting too much of your child too early. Expect that it will take quite a while for them to adapt to schooling. And in the meantime, another tip is to expect them to be wrecked in the afternoon. Mine were, they're shattered because they're just on the whole day. There's so much newness to adapt to and moving between, subjects and trying to make new friends. And, there's so much to pay attention to. Mine were exhausted. And despite the fact that there's so many fabulous activities on offer after school, I'd suggest you don't pack too much in for your little ones in those first few months because they're going to be really, really tired. Now, I've written a little prompt there. Question time is coming up. So if you're already thinking, no, I definitely have a question I'd like to ask, you're welcome to start throwing it into the chat box and we'll get there shortly. The other thing you can do, if you haven't been doing this already, is to really focus on the way you use praise with your child, because we know that there's certain ways of praising our children in terms of focusing on the process, the ideas they've come up with, the problem-solving efforts they've taken, their persistence, concentration, effort, that build what we call a growth mindset. And growth mindset is the belief that it's your effort, your hard work, and your determination that gets you success. It's not just sheer talent. And if it's tricky, well, you mustn't be talented enough, so you should probably give up. We don't want our children ever thinking that. To develop a resilient approach to learning, we need them knowing that it's what you put into the process that matters. And the way we emphasize that for our children is by focusing on the process when we comment on and acknowledge them and provide them with praise. So rather than saying things like, "You're so smart," or "That's a great end result that you've produced," it's really about saying things like, "Wow, I saw how much effort you put into that. That's super cool." Or, "You were concentrating so hard when you did that. I was so impressed with that." Or, "Look at how many ideas you came up with." It's really drumming home for our children. It's the process that matters. It's how you get there. And this other wonderful phrase that my children came home with from school, which we still use today, even though they're considerably older now, is this idea of flirting, which is just the mushing together of the words failing and learning, the fact that we learn through our mistakes, and that's a good thing. You know, we look at all the wonderful ways we can learn, and flirting is one of them. It's learning through mistake making. So my children were taught at their school to welcome flirting. If you make a mistake, you go, oh, okay, good, there's something to be learnt here. And you figure out what that is, and you learn from it, rather than to, you know, be really down on yourself or to give up, which is some children's tendency. So introducing that ahead of time, I know I model for my children a whole lot of flirting a lot of the time, but celebrating flirting, using that language or your own version of it, and really teaching them that, you know, school provides wonderful opportunities for learning, and mistake making, that's learning too. One of the last tips I'll share is that you just have to keep your own emotions in check. As you would well know, children are barometers of household tension, and they will absolutely pick up on how you're feeling about them starting school. If you had a terrible time at school, which some of us did, or if you hated school or you found it a really anxiety-provoking place to be, you've kind of got to park that in the past and not let that colour your child's experience or enjoyment of their schooling time. If you're feeling really anxious about your child starting school, your child will pick up on that and feel really anxious themselves, assuming that there's danger in there, unseen danger that they're not yet aware of, but they need to be really wary of. We really need to be very careful to keep our own emotions in check and to not let them colour our children's experience. The last I'll just touch on, which I've mentioned before in previous webinars, is just to remember that stress builds resilience. Now, stress, as I mentioned before, occurs along a continuum from manageable, supported, tolerable, manageable, supported stress down one end, which is starting school, forgetting your hat, not being able to play outside, not enjoying your lunch one day at school, not being invited to a friend's party. These are all manageable stresses that you support them through. And then at the other end, we have that severe, unsupported, toxic stress that we see in cases of abuse and neglect. And somewhere along the middle, we have what we call tolerable stress, which is where really big things happen. You know, parents get divorced, a loved one dies. And these stresses are made tolerable by the fact that they're still supported by us through them. But there's a whole lot of this one end, manageable, supported stress, that is actually going to be felt by our children when they start school. And the good news is that's the kind of stress that builds resilience. So as much as it might be hard to watch our child not be allocated the same class as their friend, for example, unless you think that's a real deal breaker for settling your child into school, sometimes we have got to take a step back and think, this is one of those manageable, supported stress moments that's going to build resilience in my child. So just remember, as you are keeping your own emotions in check, it's okay for your child to feel disappointed sometimes, to feel frustrated, to feel stressed or upset. Life's like this. You know that, you know, life's going to throw at them far more than they're going to experience in their first year of school, but they won't be well equipped to manage the big stuff if they haven't been able to experience the little stuff. And the reality is there's a whole lot of change that happens at school. Every year their classroom teacher will change. The student mix will change in their classes, deliberately, often by the school, year after year. So even friends that they're in with one year, they won't be in with the second year. There's new experiences, new expectations, new demands on them as school progresses. And while these situations are tricky, they also provide this helpful resilience building, manageable stress experiences that they actually need to become resilient grown-ups one day. Helping our children to navigate these transitions in a nurturing, encouraging way is, rather than protecting them from it or jumping in to save them, is what builds their resilience. I'll just run you through a couple of resources there before we finish up, and then we'll turn to questions. The first one you'll see there, so these are advice packs, video-based advice packs that I've got on my website. There is one on school readiness. that you're welcome to have a look or to share with partners or friends who haven't been able to join us for the webinar if you think that might be helpful. And here are a few of my other websites and social media platforms that I often share articles and tips on too, that you're welcome to keep in contact with me on. But now we'll refer to questions.